The most important thing with our new strategy is not just the presence of officers and helping to address some of the immediate concerns, but the activation of the space.
Well, that's Senior Deputy Mayor Manisha Harrell, niece of the mayor, who spoke to me on Seattle Channel a few months ago. She's reportedly stepping down from her role. Why? What does that mean? And also, what new measure is the city council considering to clamp down on high-speed drivers in West Seattle and other parts of the city, too? Plus, what is next for the King County Regional Homelessness Authority after a milestone moment last week? Well, all these stories and more on Seattle News, Views, and Brews this week, your coffee break political podcast. I'm Brian Callanan. I'm a host on Seattle Channel. The views expressed here are my own, and I'm joined once again with co-host David Croman, transportation reporter for the Seattle Times. And David, I wanted your transportation reporter expertise on this. I saw this ranking from the financial site Wallet Hub a little earlier on this year that said Washington is one of the worst states to drive in, looking at traffic safety, congestion, the cost of keeping a car on the road. Do you think that's true?
Yeah, I don't know. I haven't spent a lot of time in other states. I'm always a little skeptical of, financial firms and law firms and insurance and things like that with their rankings and things like that. Worst to drive in, I don't know. Some of Massachusetts isn't great, some of those East Coast areas, but yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I'm sure there's some people who agree.
Maybe I'm just saying that because I just drove in from Puyallup, but that's just me talking. But David, thank you as always for joining me. Thanks also to our background noise sponsor, City Grind Espresso, on the first floor of City Hall. Thanks also to our show patrons. Sean recently jumped on board. Thank you very much for that, Sean. He earned his very own Seattle News, Views, and Brews sticker, putting in a pledge for $5 a month. Hoping to see more of you support us there, Sean. Make sure you send in a photo of your sticker in action. We will feature it on the show. Email Seattle News, Views, and Brews at gmail.com. Thank you again for your support. And a big thank you to Converge Media. Converge airs the video version of this podcast. Check it out on Converge, Wednesdays at 7 p.m. Let's get things going with right here, right now. David, some news coming out just as we are recording our podcast here, basically. Manisha Harrell, niece of Mayor Harrell himself, appears to be on her way out as senior deputy mayor. Your colleague Sarah Grace Taylor breaking this news in the Seattle Times. No official reason given here, but Sarah's reporting that apparently there was some disagreements regarding public safety that may be a factor here. What do you make of this news, David? This is pretty big news.
Yeah, it is big news. She has really been with Mayor Harrell the whole way through his campaign and in his office.
Right, was a campaign manager for him. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly. And, I think Bruce Harrell is a guy who likes loyalty and likes working with people who he feels are close to him. And, this is his niece. He doesn't feel any kind of closer to anybody in some ways. Your sense was she really wielded a lot of power in that office. In some ways, the public kind of, on the policy level, there was almost more interaction with Manisha Harrell, is the sense I got, than even Bruce Harrell. That she, and if there was a representative in the public and he wasn't there, it was almost always her. So she was really, it's an overused phrase, but his right-hand person in this. Yeah. Sarah is reporting that a part of the reason for her departure is disagreement over approaches to public safety. I don't have great insight into this, but it rings true to me in part because of a story I did about a year ago at this point about how there was this proposal to, basically turn all of 3rd Avenue into one long bus stop and then enforce, quote, disorderly conduct at a bus stop along the entire road. It was a novel approach to crack down on basically crimes, things like loitering and things like that the mayor's office was considering doing. They eventually backed off of it and didn't do it, in part because Manisha Harrell wasn't behind it. She was the one who kind of eventually put a stop to it. So, it's interesting. It appears that she was sort of the more left, I would say, view on public safety in that office compared to probably her counterpart on the other side is Tim Burgess, former city council person. So, it'll be really interesting to see what this means for the mayor's office approach to public safety, if that is indeed the reason that she's leaving.
Right. And really the first real shakeup I've seen with Team Harrell here. Do you see that too? And again, you're talking about someone who's very close to his campaign, very much up there in terms of rankings within his cabinet, if you want to call it that. Talk to me about that piece of it, because at a time when a lot of focus is on public safety, on the mayor's office to come up with some sort of policy, as he says he's going to do when it comes to drug possession and drug use, public drug use. I think that this is a big shakeup, I guess, within the team at a very critical time is also another piece of this.
Yeah, I agree. I'm sometimes skeptical of, I was always kind of skeptical of too many stories about staff changes in mayors, mostly because it's hard for the public to wrap your head around. This doesn't fall into that category. This is a legitimately big deal because of how much power and influence she wielded in that office. And I do think her exit legitimately has the potential to change how that office functions and therefore how Mayor Harrell runs the city.
Yeah, very true. Well, we're going to see what happens with that, the fallout from that over this week and next, and what that means for Team Bruce Harrell there. So we'll see how that pans out. But I did want to talk about a few things the city council is working on this week. Pretty busy docket, actually. A public hearing about the replacement, finally, of Fire Station 31 in North Seattle, the so-called cancer house that caused so many health problems up there. We've got that full council vote on home-situated businesses we've discussed before. Also that resolution on higher pay for human services we've talked about too. But David, I really wanted to focus on an issue in the Transportation Committee this week, specifically this idea to install more traffic cameras to monitor speeding in certain areas and actually designate those areas as restricted racing zones, as recently allowed for in the state legislature. Now, these zones would include the bulk of Alki Avenue, Harbor Avenue, and West Marginal going around the northern part of West Seattle, plus some locations on Sandpoint Way, Northeast 65th Street, and North Seattle, also around Magnuson Park. What do you make of this restricted racing zone concept? How is this going to work? Do you think these cameras, et cetera, are going to make an impact?
Yeah, I mean, the camera enforcement in general is a little novel in the city. We've had red light cameras for a while, but they've expanded around, block the box and some bus transit enforcement. And from those programs, there's some evidence that they work, that there are very few repeat offenders, suggesting that people kind of get the message the first time. That said, if you're already street racing, that's sort of a willful and conscious breaking of the law. So I don't know. I think that's kind of a different scenario. In some ways, this is, I think, what's behind the city's interest in expanding these cameras, though, is it becomes sort of seen a bit as a win-win by a lot of folks because, Seattle PD is basically not enforcing traffic laws anymore, which they blame on the staffing there.
Sure.
So, for SPD, cameras are good because it kind of takes off some of the burden there. But then there's also there are civil rights advocates who like them because they're seen as a little more, you don't have an interaction with an actual person who has a badge and a gun. There's some concerns around equity as far as, historically you can see that it does tend to be, black folks or people of color who get caught with these things a little bit more and questions about where they're putting them. But, I think that there is some momentum building around automated enforcement generally, and this seems to be an extension of that.
Yeah, it does. And just to touch on that idea, you were talking about block the box, the transit-only lane, those camera enforcements. The council is talking about that this week, too. They put these programs in place back in 2020. The city has been allowed by the state to actually extend this now to the year 2025, so that's what they're doing this week. And the city has these cameras at 4 block-the-box locations. You can't block the intersection there. And actually 5 transit-only lane locations. The block-the-box cams are at eastbound 5th and Olive, northbound 4th and Jackson, southbound Westlake and Valley, northbound 4th and Battery. The transit-only cams, southbound Aurora and Gaylor, eastbound 5th and Olive, northbound 3rd and James, eastbound Columbia and 1st, southbound 3rd and Stewart. I thought I'd run down all of those there. I just wanted to talk about that a little bit more, David. Are we going to see more of these cameras popping up? I know that Greg Spots, the new head of SDOT, was certainly talking about that possibility. Talk to me about using some more of this enforcement with block-the-box and transit-only lanes, because I think that's a piece of this too.
Yeah, I do think we'll see more of it pop up, in part because of what you said, that Greg Spots appears to be an enthusiastic supporter. And also back to what I was saying before, which is it takes the burden off of and people, police don't have to enforce these laws anymore. And, or it's not so much that they don't have to enforce them. It's that the laws, the rules are basically going unenforced before because SPD just wasn't doing it. So this, if your goal is to have some enforcement around transit lanes, this is kind of the way to do it. And it's real, if you are in downtown and anytime traffic gets bad, you see people start to get out into those transit lanes and use them. So there is a need for enforcement there. And I think it does feel like, at least on those particular things, it feels a bit like once people kind of understand that there's some consequences to getting into a transit lane, that suddenly those straight lines start to feel a little more real than they do right now.
Yeah, I hear exactly what you're saying. As someone who commutes from the south part of West Seattle coming up north on 509, heading towards 99, the First Avenue South Bridge, wow, put a camera on that carpool lane there. We're talking about some dollars that could be made for any transportation department out there, just throwing it out there. At any rate, let's move on, and thank you very much for that, David. But moving on, another senseless shooting, this time in Belltown, of a pregnant mother. It led to a protest and a new plan from Seattle Police Chief Adrian Diaz as he reacts to a pre-summer spike in gun violence. We're talking about that next on Now Hear This. Some tragic headlines last week with the death of Ina Kwan, a pregnant woman who was shot and killed in an apparent random attack in the Belltown neighborhood. Doctors could not save her child. Her husband sitting next to her was injured in the attack as well. 30-year-old Cordell Gooseby has been charged with first-degree murder in that case. But this is just one of a string of shootings happening here in the month of June. 4 shootings in just a week's time. It led Police Chief Adrian Diaz to hold a press conference last week where he spoke about the creation of a task force. It's about 50 officers focused on preventing violence in 4 areas where it's been more pronounced: Aurora Avenue, downtown, the Central District, and the South End. He's bringing in some other partners, too, from around the region. Here's what he was saying about that at the press conference on Friday.
I'm marshaling the efforts of every bureau across the department to include our regional and federal partners. Because violence isn't just in Seattle, but events outside of Seattle can and do affect us. And this task force will stem the tide of gun violence, which we only know increases over the summer months.
And also of note here, David, officers pulling more guns off the street now than when the SPD actually had more cops on the street before the pandemic. 629 guns so far pulled off the street, as the chief reported. And David, I was just alarmed to see this spike in gun violence and homicides. Of course, during the pandemic, we've been talking about this, reported in the Times. 55 homicides in 2022, up from 41 the previous year. 54 people were killed in homicides in Seattle in 2020, and that's 20 more than 2019. I just see that upward trend in terms of murders here, and I know I'm asking an impossible question, but I got to put it out there. Can the city turn the tide on this trend in 2023? What do you think, and what does it take to get there?
Yeah, I don't know. There are some signs that nationally the murder rate has plateaued and might actually be kind of dipping. I don't know if that is or will apply to Seattle. There's the task force and the priority policing is oftentimes the response to these things. And, unfortunately, it seems like it's in part because there's folks often aren't really sure what else to do. We saw this when there was that shooting. I mean, people kind of forget about this a little bit because it happened right before COVID, but there was the shooting near Westlake that, at the time, the response to that was, more emphasis in Westlake and emphasis patrols and things like that. So, the issue, and they do tend to work in the short term, it seems. The issue is sustainability, and are you solving the problem? The answer oftentimes seems to be that you're not, and it comes back when the priority enforcement goes away, as it inevitably does, especially when there are just fewer police than there used to be. So that's why the city is feeling around for kind of alternatives to policing. There's some hope that as after school activities and things like that return, that some of that violence might subside a little bit. But you're right, it is an impossible question.
Yeah, and I think about this too at the county level, working on the crisis care centers levy, and really trying to get some of these walk-in type of services for people who are dealing with behavioral health problems, which Gooseby said he had when officers started coming up to him after the incident. It just amazing to think about that. But going back to the SPD, David, it just comes at a frustrating time here for the Seattle Police Department, dealing with lower than expected 911 response times in some parts of the city, as we reported last week on the podcast. And what I'm hearing from the chief, this may turn into a situation where property crimes, et cetera, will have to be triaged as the SPD puts resources into this anti-gun violence task force. I guess I'm just trying to figure out how much of a challenge this is for the SPD, just personnel-wise, to come through on trying to get a task force like this mobilized and make an impact.
Yeah, I imagine a lot. I mean, I think we heard similar things earlier from Chief Diaz. He talked about moving people off of, I don't remember exactly some of the units, but
it's some of the tactical units and things of that nature. But yeah, keep going.
Yeah, it was a couple of years ago. I mean, and my colleagues reported too on, investigations of sexual assault and that team being kind of stripped to the bone. So, it's not like this is a zero. It is in a certain way a zero-sum game right now, which is if you're moving people from one thing, it means something else suffers. And a lot of times that means those specialty units that, even I think some of those specialty units are sometimes seen even by police skeptical people as the things they want to keep. And so then it becomes doubly frustrating for people who are pushing for, police reforms or whatever that in these moments, what tends to happen is patrol and emphasis gets the people while some of the specialty units end up suffering.
Right. There are so many different ways to look at this issue. And I know the Seattle Police Department is certainly frustrated by what's going on, but a lot of good work going on out there to take guns off the street. Now it's time to try to translate that into seeing some of this violence subside, because definitely a frightening start to the very, very early part of the summer here. I want to move on to another important story here, David. There was not a lot of fanfare about this last week, but June 16th was the last day for Mark Dones as the CEO of the King County Regional Homelessness Authority. And we've talked about this agency a little bit, where it's going to go. But this week, Publicola had a very interesting piece on this, I thought. The RHA appears to be distancing itself from the Lived Experience Coalition, a voice for homeless people in our area. This relationship got strained when the LEC ran out of money to pay for some shelters it was operating. A lot of finger pointing going back and forth there. And I just get concerned about this, David, because another part of the story was this bigger plan to get new bids coming in from all these service providers connected to the RHA. It was supposed to happen this year in 2023. Now it's getting pushed into 2024, it looks like. So some mounting issues here. I guess I'm trying to figure out what expectations you have for the RHA through the end of this year and into next. Do you see it getting its house in order? Where do we go from here? And those contracts, I think, are a big piece of this.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't have a great, I'll be honest, I don't have a great take on this, but, the lived experience, that's always going to be a tension because, they want people who have been through this. Of course, you want their perspective.
Right.
At the same time, there's a certain language of politics and bureaucracy that can be, that can be difficult. I mean, you got to cross your eye, dot your I's and cross your T's. And I think that debacle we saw around that shelter money, shows that it can be difficult to sort of dip into some of this stuff. And I mean, especially around homelessness, the politics of it are so hairy and convoluted. And I don't know what the next couple of years look like. I mean, I think it's going to be a formative time for that agency.
Yeah, for sure. And just this whole idea of rebidding on these contracts that the RHA had out there, I know that was a big goal for Mark Dones to really kind of clean house and get a fresh start, but too big of a task? Or I'm just trying to figure out what happens now, because vetting all these different agencies again over the course of even a year's time, it's a lot. I mean, we're talking about dozens upon dozens of different service agencies that are connected to the RHA. I wonder where those relationships go, I guess, is where I'm thinking with this.
It is a lot. I seem to remember a few years, Seattle also rebidding out a lot of its
contracts.
Right. Mm-hmm. Going through this process before, and it's really hairy. It's not. Yeah. It is as fraught as it comes, because the homelessness response environment is quite political. I mean, it's pretty competitive from dollars. It is pitting different philosophies and approaches towards homelessness against each other, which means certain people don't get the funding that they used to have, and then
that's right.
This kind of goes back to the famed Poppy report, which advocated for Seattle kind of moving away from transitional housing and moving away from things that didn't end and didn't result directly in permanent housing. But that's tricky too, because there are people who are not on the streets right now because they're in transitional housing, even if there's not a clear plan for how to move them into permanent housing. So, some of these programs might be viewed as not great for long-term housing prospects, but are seen as better for sort of short-term mitigating emergency responses. And I think a lot of those end up being on the chopping block in these rebidding processes. And then you're kind of confronted with a very real risk of people who are not currently homeless becoming homeless.
Right.
It's really fraught. And so, doing this at a time when I guess they're going to be looking for a new CEO and kind of redefining themselves, that's a big deal, and it's difficult.
Yeah, no, a lot of eyes on that agency as it works its way into the next year. And I think looking at those contracts and how they're put together or not put together is something that a lot of people will be paying attention to as well. Thanks for that, David. I wanted to talk about something important with you coming up. What is behind a big jump in people renting bikes and scooters in this fair city of Seattle? Well, David's got two wheels on the ground and his eyes on the road for the story here. We're going to break it down on Transportation Talk. David, you recently had a piece in the Seattle Times about scooters and bike rentals in Seattle, and it sounds like they're really booming. Well, what's going on here? What's behind this phenomenon?
Yeah, they are booming. I think, I think people are just getting used to them. Enough people have accounts at this point. It's a little bit scary to do it for your first time, especially on the scooters, because it's I haven't ridden a scooter for a while until I tried one of these, but once you try it and you get your account set up and it becomes really easy to rent, I think you just kind of see more people signing up, more people comfortable. Tourism is much higher, so I'm sure that has a lot to do with it. And I think also just general return to normal activity.
Okay.
Seattle's public transit system is okay, but it has a lot of gaps in it, and I think a lot of people, myself included, when they're taking transit, use these scooters and bikes to kind of connect things. If my office is close-ish to a light rail station, I'll, rent a scooter or a bike and head over there or whatever it might be. Mm-hmm. So I think we're probably seeing some of that too. So it's a combination of a few things.
We'll see where this goes. I did want to jump in though. Were there any indications, at least, and maybe it's too early to tell, with some of the different safety concerns that surround bike rentals and scooter rentals? I know helmets aren't often involved in those rentals. Were you seeing any stats there that would indicate those safety concerns that were certainly around these different rental agencies when they started? Are those kind of popping up too, or what do we got?
Yeah, they are. Measuring this is sort of hard because most people aren't going to, you can look at police reports or emergency responses, and there are some of those. But most people, when they get hurt, are getting hurt so badly, or that they're filing a police report or calling 911, or some people who are getting hurt badly still aren't doing that. So it's not a super great way of measuring it. But they did about a year ago do a survey of something like 5,000 riders, so like a really good sample size actually, and found that like 11% had suffered some kind of injury. That's pretty high. It's pretty high, but some of those are whacking your shin with the scooter, or not all of those are super serious. But it is certainly a concern, especially because helmet use is basically non-existent. That nobody is wearing a helmet when they're taking these, and that is concerning. Advocates for them will counter. You got to do a comparison to what it looks like in cars or what cars are doing. And
sure,
I do think that's fair, that we're talking about a mode of transportation here that is probably in general safer than driving in a motor vehicle, probably a good deal less safe than taking the bus or the light rail. So, in the context, it's perhaps more safe than some, but that doesn't mean that it's not a real concern. I think in some ways, not bigger, but another concern is also just where they're located. People parking them correctly. It's a real concern. It's a real ADA concern. For people in particular who use wheelchairs, or maybe you're seeing impaired. to have all these scooters around, I think, is a real source of frustration for folks, and that's real. And something like 8% of bikes and scooters are still being parked improperly, which, when you're talking about 10,000 scooters in the city, that's quite a few. That's not nothing. So, I think safety and just the obstructive nature of them are still real concerns.
Is it a situation where, I know when the city council was first looking at this and figuring out which vendors would actually be allowed in to provide these services, is it a situation where more vendors might be coming in? I mean, when I'm thinking from a business perspective, I'm like, hey, look, that market's booming. Let's start up another service there. Is there a push for that? Would the council want to try to limit that? Where does this industry grow from here, I guess?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't actually see that because the companies that are there now, 4 of them, are not deploying all the bikes that they could be. They could do up to 12,000, I think, 12,500. And at the peak, there are about 10,000 bikes and scooters. So, there's still, I don't know what the math is, but 20% additional capacity there that could be rolled out. Some two companies actually, though, had their permits rejected by the city, in part because we didn't really get into this because this is just a short little piece for the weekend. But 2 companies had their permits rejected, in part because they couldn't demonstrate that they had their handle on the 2 things we talked about, safety and obstruction, but also the equity question of where you're going to put them be and who has access to them. So a couple of companies basically didn't pass the test and had to pull their bikes and scooters from the market. I don't know what the profit margins on these are. It seems like this is a industry that's very much in flux. I think, like a lot of startups, I know that Bird in particular has had some major issues lately, in part because I think a lot of the venture capital money that was boosting them has fallen out, and some of their numbers that they were putting out there publicly turned out to not be true, which was really bad for investors. So this industry is not on a glide path. It's not on coast mode, to use a pun. So it'll just be interesting to see what happens with it over the next few years, especially as startup money is just not as plentiful as it used to be.
Right. David, thank you for the story behind the story. Always appreciate it, my friend. I need to wrap up with you. I saw the tweet. I have been amazed at this myself. I have tomatoes growing in my backyard, David, and it's June. What's going on? Cats and dogs living together. Talk me off the ledge, man. What's going on in my garden right now?
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's just because it was such a warm spring. All the warm weather plants got super happy, and I've got flowers on all my plants and some actual tomatoes forming. So at this pace, I'm not going to complain about that. If we have 3 months of tomato production, I'd be perfectly happy with that.
Right. I've been around before where it's just, you just get maybe a couple in October and you live with it. So, hey, if they start rolling in July or August, I'm all over it. So, David, thank you as always for sharing all these different pieces of knowledge with me and keeping up that backyard garden too. Thanks to everybody listening to Seattle News, Views, and Brews, where you can always find out what's brewing in local politics. This podcast is on Apple, Spotify, wherever you listen. Please find Seattle News, Views, and Brews on Patreon. Show your support there too. Thanks for watching on Converge Media as well. We'll see you next time.
Seattle News, Views, and Brews is an independent production of Callanan Media Services. Copyright 2023.